commercial opportunities and constraints for bioenergy developments in Africa? And what needs to happen in order to support the further development of bioenergy in order to support commercial deployment? These are some of the questions that form the basis of new research. And joining me today are Ankit Agarwal and Mike Bess, both of Niras Limited, a development consultancy, to talk about the research that they've been undertaking and explain some of the results. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me.
A pleasure.
A pleasure.
Ankit, perhaps I could start with you. Why was this research undertaken, and who was the driving force behind the initiative?
Thanks, Claire. So the project that we are working on is called Bioenergy for Sustainable Energy Access in Africa, or in short, BSEA. BSEA forms part of the Transforming Energy Access Programme and is funded by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. In terms of the research focus, BSEA focused on opportunities for anaerobic digestion and combustion for electricity and or heat generation in the range of 10 kilowatts to 5 megawatts. As a first step, a range of bioenergy pathways comprising of a biomass feedstock, a conversion technology, end use and demand sector were identified and investigated across 10 target countries in Africa. These were Ghana and Nigeria in West Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda in East Africa, and South Africa, Mozambique, and Zambia in Southern Africa. The research was undertaken based on 5 interlinked themes of biomass resources, technology, economics, commercial viability, and finally institutional market and regulatory frameworks. From this, the most promising pathways for the adoption of the designated bioenergy technologies were identified. This resulted in the shortlisting of 7 priority demand sectors in 5 countries that we then investigated in more depth over the remainder of the project period.
Now, you mentioned that there were a number of demand sectors that identified. Could you perhaps share a short overview of each of these and their opportunities?
So the first demand sector that we looked at was cement manufacturing in Nigeria. Nigeria is Africa's largest cement producer, and the cement industry has traditionally used fossil fuels to supply heat for cement manufacturing. While fossil fuels are plentiful in Nigeria, cement companies are increasingly exploring co-processing with alternative fuels and primarily bioenergy. This drive has been led actually by a company called Lafarge Africa and its subsidiary Geocycle, which now co-processes fossil fuels with biomass at 4 of its 5 plants. Our research therefore explored the commercial prospects for part replacement of fossil fuels with biomass residues to provide heat in Nigeria's cement industry. The second demand sector was tea processing in Kenya. Kenya is the world's largest exporter of black tea, and the sector is currently dominated by smallholder production through 70 independent factories that are owned by over 650,000 tea growers. Tea processing in general requires significant quantities of thermal energy, and this accounts for about 90% of a typical tea factory's energy needs and up to 30% of their costs. Heat is currently produced at these KTDA factories using fuel wood. With this energy source becoming more and more difficult and expensive to obtain in some areas, some of the KTDA factories have explored alternative biomass fuels such as briquettes and agri-processing residues. Our research therefore explored the prospects for part replacement of fuel wood with such non-wood biomass to provide heat in Kenya's tea processing sector. The third demand sector was wood processing in Tanzania. Tanzania has East Africa's most extensive forest resources and some of the region's largest wood processing industries. However, only 2 of these companies use these residues for CHP, that is combined heat and power, to meet their internal electricity and heat demands and to sell excess electricity to the grid. Given the availability of actually suitable and plentiful feedstock and the environmental benefits of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, the landscape for such wood residue-based CHP in Tanzania's wood processing industry was explored. The fourth demand sector we looked at was palm oil processing in Ghana. Oil palm is an important agricultural crop in Ghana, whereby large-scale processors who account for about 40% of the oil output have sufficient throughput and financial capacity to support investments in bioenergy technologies. 6 of Ghana's largest oil palm processors have in fact already installed combustion-based CHP plants that use solid oil palm residues to supply their own electricity and process heat. There's only one company that we found, GOPDC, Ghana Palm Oil Development Company, that also uses something called the palm oil mill effluent, which is a byproduct that is generated when oil palm is processed as a feedstock for an AD system to generate biogas. The use of POME-based AD also reduces the environmental risks of improper POME disposal. This research therefore explored the commercial opportunities of POME-based AD in Ghana's palm oil industry. The fifth demand sector was horticulture in Kenya. Kenya has a large and diverse horticultural industry, whereby large quantities of residues are generated during grading, cleaning, and processing of fruits and vegetables. While the solid residues are generally composted or fed to livestock, liquid residues can create disposal problems, and it actually presents a good opportunity for AD as a waste management solution. Despite this potential, only a handful of horticultural companies have actually installed AD systems to generate heat and electricity from their feedstocks. Our research therefore analyzed the implications and commercial opportunities for wider adoption of AD in Kenya's horticultural sector. The sixth demand sector we looked at was dairy in South Africa. South Africa, as you know, has the largest commercial dairy industry in sub-Saharan Africa. The sector has seen a considerable amount of consolidation over the past 2 decades. This consolidation actually presents an opportunity for producing energy from cattle manure in farms where large herds are stalled indoors and the manure is available readily as feedstock. While South Africa is actually seen as a leader in biogas industry in sub-Saharan Africa, there's been a limited adoption of AD within the dairy sector. And our research therefore explored this landscape for AD in South Africa's dairy industry and the potential for further adoption. The final and the seventh demand sector we looked at was sisal processing in Kenya. Kenya is the world's third largest sisal producer, and about 95% of its sisal production comes from 10 large estates. Anaerobic digestion AD based on sisal processing waste can therefore be used to generate electricity and also to safely manage these residues. However, we found that there's only one estate, that's Kilifi Plantations, that has made such an investment. So the experiences of Kilifi and other estates were investigated to establish the bottlenecks and opportunities for wider adoption of AD in Kenya's sisal industry. So that's a very quick overview of our 7 demand sectors and the reasons why we looked at them.
Oh, it certainly sounds like there's a lot of effort and work that was put into this. Mike, perhaps I could ask you to give some idea of the themes that you were working with and what the results or conclusions were that you came to.
Thank you very much. Well, effectively, the model for analyzing whether, the whole framework for bioenergy is effectively a supply chain model. So we start with the bioenergy feedstock, the resource. We look at the technology that basically converts, utilizes that. We then look at the business model that goes into how the feedstock is acquired, how it's transformed, and so forth. We look at the economics to see, what the framework is for that to make a successful business. And finally, then we look at the regulatory, institutional, policy framework. All these affect whether or not bioenergy works or doesn't. So obviously starting with feedstock is the logical one, because basically if you don't have the feedstock, you're not going to have the bioenergy. So effectively there are several sort of rules about this, that if you have your own feedstock, that is, if you grow it, you basically you can do what you want to with it. And therefore the issues of acquiring feedstock are quite diminished. So we've looked at a number of, Ankit has highlighted a number of examples, 7 case studies that we did within those areas. Ankit mentioned a couple of enterprises where they have controlled their own feedstock. In the case of sisal, in the case of wood processing, in the case of dairy, And those are really quite important. If you don't have your own feedstock, then basically locking in supply is quite important. Ankit mentioned in Nigeria in the cement sector, Lafarge Africa has a special purpose vehicle company called Geocycle, which is part of the Lafarge Wholesome International alternative fuels. And they've locked in oil palm residues, solid residues, for feeding in, as Ankit mentioned, co-processing with natural gas. The second area that we really is important is technology, obviously. So the more purpose-built the better. And if that purpose-built is off the shelf or something off the shelf, then that's even better yet, particularly because it can be tried and true. So sort of an example of that, Ankit mentioned the Kenya Tea Development Agency and the 70 smallholder tea factories. Effectively, what they did when they converted it from fuel oil to wood from 2008 to 2012 was they just ordered 70 boiler sets all at once. So you get the economies of scale, a reduced price. You get the benefit of having spare parts and service, after purchase service, and so forth. If you're not able to get off the shelf, then purpose built is pretty much the rule of the game, and that's particularly the case in anaerobic digestion, which makes up about 4 of our case studies. This leads us up to the business plan element, and that really encompasses all of these things. So in terms of having a business plan that's successful, you need to basically have your feedstock supply sorted out, whether that be your own supply or whether you're contracting that in. Another part of the business plan is basically making sure that you have your stocks, you have your finance, you have everything pretty well locked in, so that you can weather changes. Another aspect is the economics, obviously. So keeping your capital expenditures low as possible, to keeping your operating costs expenditures low, is very, very important. And this is very difficult in bioenergy, but the risk from that, particularly on the operating costs, can be minimized again by starting again and looking at feedstock and saying, well, if I have my own feedstock, then that's pretty well locked in. If I don't, then basically using the model that we were talking about in Nigeria, where you lock in suppliers and so forth, helps a lot. Last but not least is the institutional and policy framework. And this is probably the area where we find the most difficulty in bioenergy enterprises succeeding and lasting. If you generate only heat, such as our cement factory, our Kenya tea smallholders, that's fine. There's no Ministry of Heat in any of these countries. Heat regulations are basically your own. Obviously, there are health and safety issues and so forth. But the minute you get into selling electricity or generating electricity, number one, you move into a whole different world. You do have ministries of energy. You do have energy regulatory authorities. You have statutes and so forth and so on. And the area of bioenergy compared to other renewables is not very well supported in sub-Saharan Africa. So bioenergy actually operates, particularly when you get into electricity generation, in a fairly, I wouldn't say hostile, but it's close to it. It's not a very welcoming one, highly regulated. The feed-in tariffs, when they're there, are generally not sufficient to cover the costs. And therefore, the rule of the game for success for most of these enterprises is to generate their own electricity for their own use and not try and sell it to the grid. And that's a shame, because basically having renewable energy, electricity being sold into the grid can really help in rural development. But the reality is that there's not a country one that we looked at where a tariff, a feed-in tariff on electricity was sufficient to cover the costs. Our study has shown that the institutional regulatory framework for all of these countries is not very favorable and supportive for bioenergy. It's a shame to say, but it's something that we found out.
Thanks very much. I wanted to thank both of you for sharing the research and your results. We look forward to hearing about how biogas can develop as a fuel stock in Africa, and to keeping abreast of the journey being taken within the sector and the commercialization thereof.